This is Module 2. In this module, you will identify and know about the Code of Professional Conduct established for court interpreters serving the Supreme Court of Ohio. 10 canons comprise this code, just like the one you learned about in Module 1. Through the examples in this presentation, you will gain insight into the principles and standards of conduct expected of you as a judiciary interpreter. Exercises will be provided for you to apply the canons of this code to certain situations. Finally, a short quiz will help you verify that you have understood the concepts and applications of this code in your work as a court interpreter. Canon 1. High Standards of Conduct. Interpreters and translators shall conduct themselves in a manner consistent with the dignity of the court and shall be as unobtrusive as possible, consistent with the ends of justice. What does it mean to be unobtrusive? As defined in the New Oxford American Dictionary, it means, quote, not conspicuous or attracting attention, unquote. The interpreter's presence should be barely noticeable. While interpreting simultaneously, for example, the interpreter's voice cannot stand out or be distracting to anybody who is listening to another speaker. Body movement should be limited to the point of being unnoticeable. This means that interpreters and translators should maintain high standards of conduct at all times to promote public confidence in the administration of justice. Canon 2. Accuracy and completeness. Interpreters and translators shall render a complete and accurate interpretation or translation without altering, omitting, or adding anything to what is spoken or written, and shall do so without explaining the statements of the original speaker or writer. Let's analyze this piece by piece. In the case of an interpreter, the interpreter should interpret everything said in the courtroom, and even in a mediation or other official judicial activity. In the courtroom, you should take your cue to begin interpreting when the case is called for the record and the parties introduce themselves. The judge addresses the litigants and holds a hearing. If you have any doubt as to whether you should interpret or not, another cue is to watch a court reporter typing anything being said, or being aware of any light showing that an electronic device is recording the proceedings. You must interpret without omitting anything in a conversation that is happening during the hearing involving the limited English proficient individual. It is logical that if you have the proper skills and knowledge of terminology, you should be able to interpret everything said accurately, completely, and faithfully without changing or editing or adding anything to what is being said. You must have a good grasp of jargon, slang, and technical terminology in both languages. You must be able to converse in a full range of registers in both languages. The skills that you should have to comply with this canon are the ability to speak clearly and enunciate in both English and the other language. You should have good communication skills and short-term memory. You should be familiar with the Ohio court system and procedures, as well as familiarity with the legal systems of the country or countries of the other language. Another factor that underscores the need for accuracy is that interpreters must speak in the first person so that there is a clear and accurate record that reflects the statements and questions of the people who pronounce them, rather than speaking in the third person, using reported speech. For example, if a person says, "I am not guilty," the interpreter shall say, "I am not guilty." Let's go now to Canon 3. Canon 3. Impartiality and avoidance of conflicts of interest. Interpreters and translators shall be impartial and unbiased. Interpreters and translators shall refrain from conduct that may give the appearance of bias and shall disclose any real or perceived conflict of interest. In Module 1, you became familiar with this canon as part of the National Center for State Courts Code of Professional Responsibility. Do you remember the types of behavior that you should exhibit as a court interpreter, as well as the types of behavior that you should avoid when in such capacity? Here is an example that prompted a complaint by one party in a divorce case. In the hallway, the plaintiff observed the court interpreter have a conversation with the plaintiff's husband for a few seconds. It looked like they were friendly with each other. After that conversation, the husband exited the courtroom as the interpreter walked inside. The wife reported a complaint of bias by the interpreter to her attorney. The attorney reported that complaint to the Office of Interpreter Services. The office followed up with the interpreter and asked the reason for the conversation with the husband. The interpreter reported that, as he was rushing to walk into the courtroom to report for the hearing, he ran into the husband. The husband, noticing the ethnic similarity with the interpreter, asked him if he was the interpreter. The interpreter said yes, and that he had to check in with the clerk to provide the service. After that brief exchange, each one went his own way. The wife saw what appeared to be a bias in the interpreter. So you see, you must be careful about what appearance you give to others who are observing you. You must remember to behave in a professional manner towards all people, always. Let's go to Canon 4, Confidentiality. Interpreters and translators shall protect from unauthorized disclosure all privileged or other confidential communications, documents, or information they hear or obtain while acting in a professional capacity. Interpreters and translators must maintain confidentiality with respect to any communication, document, information, or other type of confidential matter, including police and medical records and attorney-client privileged communications. As defined by the New American Oxford Dictionary, privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. In an attorney-client relationship, the client owns the privilege and shares information with the attorney representing the client in a confidential manner. It is like sharing a secret with someone, and then the attorney protects the client's interest by not telling anyone anything that the client has just shared with the attorney. Section 2317.02 of the Revised Code of the State of Ohio applies to interpreters as part of the protection of the privileged and confidential communications between attorney and client. Canon 5, Representation of Qualifications. Interpreters and translators shall accurately and completely represent their credentials, certifications, training, references, and pertinent experience. It is always helpful to carry with you a portfolio where you have copies of your diplomas, certificates of qualifications, training, letters of reference, and recommendations from other clients. As indicated in Module 1, keep track of your work in terms of dates and duration of each assignment. Stated by Sylvia Kalina in an article on ethical challenges in different interpreting settings in 2015, she quoted Marzocchi as follows, quote, "Interpreters who lack professional qualifications but are sometimes recruited even as court interpreters tend to play down their role and responsibility. They ignore that they should render everything and remain impartial." Unquote. Such interpreters may not know that they must interpret everything said accurately, completely, and faithfully, and instead provide summaries based on their decisions about what is important or not. Canon 6, Proficiency. Interpreters and translators shall provide professional services only in matters in which they can proficiently perform. As stated in the Ohio Code of Conduct, if you accept an assignment, you warrant that you have the skills, training, and competence in the terminology to interpret or translate accurately and effectively in the given setting, that you are fluent in the required languages, and have the ability to understand regional differences and dialects. As an interpreter, you have the duty to request from the court and the parties all pertinent information and materials, but you will need to prepare for the case or court function. Canon 8 of the National Center for State Courts touches upon proficiency and, more specifically, interpreting abilities. These will be tested when having to deal with fast-speaking people, background noises, and distractions. Your proficiency with the terms used during a proceeding will depend on the background information you have collected before the assignment. This is not a time for improvisation. If you're not ready for the assignment, decline doing it and let somebody else do it. Canon 7. Assessing and reporting impediments to performance. Interpreters and translators shall at all times assess their ability to perform effectively and accurately. If an interpreter or translator discovers anything impeding full compliance with the oath or affirmation of the interpreter or translator and this code, the interpreter or translator shall immediately report this information to the court. This canon is very similar to Canon 8 of the National Center for State Courts Code. The slight difference between the two is in discovering impediments to your ability to comply fully with the oath or affirmation that you give as an interpreter or translator. Be aware of your surroundings. Ask questions that will help you prepare for an assignment and determine if you can perform your duties as an interpreter. Here is another situation. If you cannot understand a witness or defendant, notify the judge and seek clarification. In this field, you need to maintain a professional demeanor. However, how do you deal with emotional or heart-rending situations in hearings? If they affect you or you feel that they will affect your performance, it is better that you ask the judge for a short recess to compose yourself or ask to be relieved by another interpreter. Or picture this. An audiovisual exhibit will be presented, and the attorney requests that you provide a simultaneous interpretation of it. Do you understand what the task will demand of you? Ask the interpreter coordinator if there is a policy and procedures to actually comply with that request. Be careful trying to do everything on the fly. Canon 8. Duty to report ethical violations. Interpreters and translators shall report to the courts any effort to impede their compliance with any law, this code, or other official policy governing interpreting or translating. Interpreters and translators shall promptly report to the appropriate legal or disciplinary authority if they observe another interpreter or translator improperly performing an assignment, accepting remuneration apart from authorized fees, disclosing privileged or confidential communications, documents, or information, or otherwise committing a breach of this code. For example, if the party requests that you not interpret while the judge is speaking because he tells you he understands enough English, you should alert the judge of this request. Now, mind you, this request in and of itself may not be done with any bad intentions at all. You must professionally address the court stating the party's request. Very likely, the judge will conduct a voir dire by asking the party about his level of fluency in English. Sometimes, judges allow for the interpreter, upon motion of the party through their attorneys, to interpret partially the proceedings before the court and to assist the party if he or she has not understood something. Some other times, judges instruct parties that they must communicate through an interpreter by listening and speaking through the interpreter. If a party persists in their attempt to get you to violate the code, you must report this to the attorney, or the judicial officer, or the interpreter coordinator. Canon 9. Scope of practice. Interpreters and translators shall not give legal advice, communicate their conclusions with respect to any answer, express personal opinions to individuals for whom they are interpreting or translating, or engage in any other activity that may be construed to constitute a service other than interpreting or translating while serving as an interpreter. As an interpreter or translator, your main role is to enable others to communicate. You should limit yourself exclusively to interpret or translate. You are reminded that you are not the one that initiates the communication. It is others, like the judge, attorneys, or litigants. There are some exceptions when you must initiate communication as detailed below. While interpreting, you may be required to ask someone to repeat something that you did not hear well, or you may need to ask for clarification because a word was not understood in context, or because the speaker or signer did not speak or sign clearly. In those instances, you speak for yourself in the third person so that the record is clear as to who is doing the speaking. As stated in Module 1, at no time should you give advice. An example of this is not giving suggestions to an attorney about organizations that may provide assistance to their client because they speak the client's language. If the party asks you to recommend them an attorney, even one who speaks their language, you should not even be having that conversation with that party. And of course, you should not give any referrals or recommendations of attorneys to the parties. Also, you should not explain forms, their purpose, or contents therein. You cite translate forms and documents only upon request by the court or the party's attorneys or a court employee. Remember that you must perform cite translations of documents for parties only in the presence of another person like a judge, attorney, or court employee. They are the ones who can and should answer any questions by the parties. Canon 10. Restrictions from public comment. Consistent with Canon 4 of this code, interpreters and translators shall not publicly discuss, report, or offer an opinion concerning a matter in which they are or have been engaged, even when that information is not privileged or required by law to be confidential. You must refrain from making any public comments or giving your opinion or a report with regards to any details of the case or core function in which you are providing or have provided interpreting services. It does not matter that the information is or is not privileged or confidential. This restriction, according to the Ohio Code, does not apply to general public comments or reports concerning the interpreting or translating professions. And you should be cautious, too, not to walk a fine line between commenting about your profession and citing words being used during a trial in progress just to talk about idiomatic misunderstandings or other linguistic and cultural issues. Such comments can have repercussions that could affect the course of a trial or hearing in progress. This marks the end of the listening session for Module 2. This concludes the information about the 10 canons of the Ohio Code of Professional Conduct for Interpreters. Now, please turn to the exercises that are accessible with the link provided. You will also have a quiz to test your understanding of relevant terms and the Code of Professional Conduct of Ohio.